So look, in this new policy briefing for COP30, we've looked at some of the big trends over the last 5-10 years in the net zero transition. What we do know is that last year we saw $2.1 trillion invested in the transition globally. We know that solar power is now the cheapest form of energy in history. Costs have come down 99% since the 1970s, 80% since 2010. So there's a lot of positives there. But if we look behind the big numbers of just over 2 trillion, we see that only 15% of investment flows are reaching emerging markets outside of China, where they're most needed. And so that's a bit of a problem because we're looking at a global transition to net zero, and so we need the capital to really reach where the needs are greatest. I think it's really important to examine the role of institutional investors in this big picture. At PRI, we've got more than 5,000 institutional investor signatories. We engage with them a lot on climate change as one of the top priority issues. And they tell us every day that really they're integrating climate risk into their portfolio management. Just this year in 2025, our signatories reported to us that 4/5, 80%, have integrated processes now to assess and to identify climate risks that are relevant to their portfolios. But not only on the climate risk picture, they're also allocating capital. So one subset of the signatories that we're looking at here are those that are part of the asset owners in PRI-supported initiatives. Those signatories alone have allocated more than $500 billion to climate solutions in recent years. And that's been increasing. It may plateau and reach a limit without supportive policy and an enabling environment, but the signatories are doing a lot. But one important point, though, is that they've really communicated to governments that they're concerned. They're communicating to governments that they're concerned about the existing current policies that put us on a pathway for 2.8 Celsius this century. So that's really concerning from the perspective of economic risk, financial risk. That's why they're acting on it, and that's why they want to work with governments collectively to accelerate the transition. Despite all that recent progress, the capital that is flowing does not come close to the needs, right? There are some specific problems here when we look at existing government policies whereby we've seen a lot of progress, don't get me wrong, but collectively, governments are still committed to more than double the fossil fuel production that's compatible with the Paris Agreement's lower limit. So that's a problem. What's promising is that the Circle of Finance Ministers for Climate Action have identified that they have the levers to stop the fossil fuel subsidies and redirect those savings into clean energy and resilience. So many governments are aware that they have the levers to make these changes and to accelerate the transition. Another reason, though, that the capital is not flowing to where it's really needed is some specific characteristics around emerging markets. So investments in emerging markets for institutional investors are subject to foreign exchange risk, policy instability in some cases, and sort of interpretations around risk profiles that may not match the risk-return needs of institutional capital. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the emerging market space. Ultimately, if emissions continue to increase in emerging markets, it means higher system-level risks to all of us. The IMF have been very clear that that means macroeconomic instability, it means risks to the global financial system, and so it's in everybody's interests ultimately that investors and governments work together to accelerate the transition. We hope this new policy briefing we've produced for COP30 reaches national and international policymakers. Ultimately, the key message to policymakers is that investors are really concerned about climate change. Institutional investors are at the table working on climate risk, integrating it into their own decisions and allocating to the transition. But they're not able to do so at the scale to match needs, and therefore we need an enabling policy environment. So what we're talking about when we say an enabling policy environment is national transition plans, investment plans to back those up, and there's some specific recommendations in there for policymakers about what it is that would help institutional investors allocate more to the transition.